Hello and welcome all to the final talk of the Wild Talk series that we organized within the context of our graduate research studio this semester at Istanbul Bilgi University Faculty of Architecture, called Rewilding the Metropolis and Yaban Kent in Turkish. And our final speaker, thank you so much, Jamie. He has agreed to come from the University of Oxford, the School of Geography and the Environment. I'll just make a brief introduction before I give the floor to Jamie. Professor Lorimer, Jamie, is an environmental geographer whose research examines the production of environmental knowledge and how this knowledge comes to shape the world around us. It focuses on powerful understandings of nature and their consequences for human and non-human life across different spatial scales. And he has a recent book called The Probiotic Planet. And during our classes, we have read quite a bit of the wildlife in the Anthropocene book. So thanks so much. You've been a great help. And today he'll be giving a talk titled The Probiotic Turn and Urban Rewilding. Thanks so much for coming.
Great. Well, many thanks, Ellie, for the invitation, and thank you all for joining. So I prepared a PowerPoint presentation, and I will share my screen in a minute. But just to give a few words of background before I disappear. So I thought I'd start with something of an overview of the argument in the book of the Probiotic Planet, and then focus in more specifically on rewilding as one manifestation of this idea of probiotic thinking and practice. And then to focus in even more detail in on what it might mean for the city, for urban design, urban planning, and architecture. And in some ways, I was fortunate that I'd given a similar talk to a group at the Bartlett School at the UCL, in which they'd asked me to come and talk about the idea of rewilding for London. And so I've slightly kept that focus in as much as I don't know very much about Istanbul, but it will be interesting to see how much what we thought might be relevant for London might or might not be relevant for Istanbul and other cities that you're working on. So I'll talk. I mean, I have quite a few slides, so I will go, and we're probably a small enough number that if people want to ask questions along the way, we can. But if not, I will proceed through my talk, and then we can take questions at the end. I've got probably a good hour and a half now, so there should be plenty of time for discussion. Okay, let me bring up my slides then, and we can get going on the presentation. How is that? Can you see some slides? Okay, fantastic.
Yes.
So as Ellie said, the book was published in early November, and it rests on this argument that we might usefully understand the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene being this label that geologists have come up with to describe the contemporary epoch as the outcome of a set of antibiotic modes of managing life. And by antibiotic, I mean the specific chemicals that we might take to address diseases, but in some ways a more profound philosophy of how non-human life has been conceived during the modern period, and a particular imperative towards eradicating, controlling, simplifying, smoothing, speeding up ecological systems for the purposes of delivering a desired set of anthropocentric values, be they health, be they food production, be they security in the face of natural disasters. And we can see examples of this antibiotic approach across a range of different spatial scales and scientific domains. So from what I guess we'd associate with the label antibiotic, efforts to prescribe drugs to tackle infectious diseases, the application of similar types of approaches to agriculture, the use of pesticides to do away with eradicate undesirable pests. But we could think about it more systematically in the ways in which intensive agricultural systems or forms of land management are very much about controlling, organizing, rationalizing the dynamics of ecological systems, often through the creation of much simplified versions of the ecology that was there previously. And this has led to a range of benefits for some people in some parts of the world. It's clearly, enhanced the quality of life. It's enhanced life expectancy. It's led to food security, and we could produce a long list of benefits of the antibiotic model. But there is a growing concern that the antibiotic model has gone too far, and that the excessive application of these antibiotic approaches has led to what Rob Wallace describes as forms of Anthropocene blowback, so the unintended consequences of the excessive application of antibiotic modes of managing life. And again, we can think about these as being common across a range of different ecological scales. So from the microbial scale, we've known for some time about the risks of the overuse of antibiotic drugs, concerns about antimicrobial resistance, for example, both in the human application of these chemicals, but also in the ways in which these chemicals are used in intensive agricultural settings, intensive chicken farming or intensive pork production, for example. Another set of work concerned with what's called biosecurity, about the ways in which intensive agricultural systems lead to the conditions for the emergence of superbugs or super diseases. This argument that Rob Wallace makes in his book that big farms make big flu. Potentially, that is the origin story of COVID. It's still yet to be firmly established whether COVID came from within the intensities of industrial agriculture. It was certainly spread by the globalized nature of the agricultural food system, or whether COVID came from a contact with a sort of exotic outside. But either way, it's well established that there are these pathological tendencies within intensive modern agriculture as a consequence of the excessive use of antibiotic approaches. We find similar thinking around discussions about the human microbiome. This idea that the excessive use of antibiotic drugs to treat infectious disease might be leading to the absence of particular microbes, what Martin Blaser describes as missing microbes, that are strongly correlated with the rise of a range of autoimmune, allergic, inflammatory diseases, what Moses Velasquez-Manoff describes as epidemics of absence, a sense that the modern human is haunted by the absence of particular microbes that lead to what's called dysbiosis in the human body and by extension in the wider environment. Moving up scales, this idea that what Greg Holling and others describe as command and control models, which have been common in intensive forest management, intensive ways of managing fire, ways of managing floods, can be pathological. The ways in which modern forms of resource management, although they might optimize for the production of timber or the production of food, can inherently lead to particular disasters as a consequence of the loss of biodiversity or the loss of resilience that makes them prone to particular types of disaster. And we could think about this right up at the planetary scale, the idea that the Anthropocene, which is marked by the end of the Holocene, the end of the climatic conditions that led to the rise of human civilization, is coming to an end. For people like James Lovelock, this is the revenge of Gaia. This is the planet tipping out of a hospitable system because of the overuse of, if you like, antibiotic modes of life, and particularly the overuse of fossil fuels and the neglect of the ecological properties of the Earth system that might keep us within a desired planetary state. Let's see. So these are, familiar stories to environmentalists, familiar stories to those interested in medical science. It's probably fair to say they've not been connected up in the way that I'm proposing here. And they have produced a range of different policy and scientific responses. And what the book's particularly interested in is a common strand of work that responds to the excesses of antibiotic modes of managing life and the forms of blowback that they caused by what I call probiotic interventions. And probiotic here describes proactive efforts to use life to manage life. So the idea is that you could identify key elements within an ecology and you could restore them, and you could manipulate the dynamics of the ecology such that you could restore desired functions and services, potentially tipping a system back into a desired stable state. And the key thing is that this isn't a rejection of antibiotic modern approaches. It's much more of a recalibration, a kind of nuancing of some of the techniques about how life is understood and controlled, such that you could secure the delivery of desired services and functions. And so the book looks at this across a range of different examples across different scales. And apologies for the amount of text in this table. Hopefully you're seeing it on a big enough screen that you can just about make up what's represented there. But the rows of the table move from the micro scale up to the macro scale. So the rows that go down on the left. So we move from examples from human health right the way up to the planetary. And the columns on the table tell this story that I just sketched out in the introduction of the rise of an antibiotic model way of conceiving and managing life, the diagnosis of forms of blowback, and then the emergence of a range of probiotic alternatives to tackle forms of blowback. And what we see in those probiotic alternatives are some common ways in which life is understood, ways in which life might be governed, and ways in which life might be valued in different ways, all of which I describe as probiotic modes of managing life. Some of them will be familiar to you, no doubt. Some of them are perhaps less familiar to people in different parts of the world or in different, who've come across particular problems in their lives. I could talk about this at great length, but it's probably best to move on to a more specific example of the probiotic turn, which is this idea of rewilding, which you find under the conservation strand, under the conservation row in the sort of bottom half of the table. Okay, so if we turn then to rewilding as an example of probiotic approaches to managing life. So you may well have come across rewilding through the readings that you've done for the course or through other exposure to popular media. It's certainly become a kind of zeitgeist term in the UK and in other parts of Europe. I'm not sure how much it's traveled out to other places. But rewilding is promoted as a new approach to nature conservation that's less concerned with managing extinction or preventing extinction or targeted at particular species, and much more interested in the reintroduction of ecological functions and processes. So it's much more about enabling the desired circulation of life within ecological systems. And a key focus within rewilding is this idea of what are called keystone species. So keystone species are species that may well not be very abundant within an ecology, but they exert disproportionate influence over how that ecosystem works. And the most famous, if you like, flagship example of the keystone species is the wolf, and particularly the story of the wolves at the Yellowstone National Park in the USA. So the wolves went absent from much of North America. They were hunted to near extinction in the US. But from the 1990s onwards, they were returned initially because they like wolves. But it transpired that wolves are able to exert this landscape scale influence because of the ways in which they change the behaviors of other animals in the food system, in the food web that they're caught up within. Partly they eat the animals, but it seemed to be more important that wolves created what were called an ecology of fear. So the herbivores knew that in the presence of wolves, they had to change their grazing behaviors because they would otherwise get eaten. And in changing their grazing behaviors, they changed the types of plants that they ate. And this led to quite radical shifts in what plants grew where in the national park that led to this resurgence of particular types of biological community that ecologists valued. So there's this sort of notion of a trophic cascade, that the wolf has this leverage over the ecological system, and its return in some ways restored the desired dynamics of that ecological system. So wolves are a prominent example. In the UK, we don't have wolves. We used to have wolves, we don't have wolves anymore, but we've got quite excited about beavers as another example. So beavers are promoted as ecosystem engineers. In building their dams, they retain a lot of water in the landscape. And in retaining water in the landscape, they're celebrated because they might prevent flooding, which has been a big issue in the UK, but also that they would store water in the landscape and help clean it, and that they might also create conditions that are conducive to the rise of biodiversity. So beavers would be another example where a relatively small number of organisms can have these landscape scale impacts that would deliver desired ecosystem services. They provide what are described as nature-based solutions to a range of environmental problems in that way. Okay, so the first element of rewilding is very much about this sort of functional model of conservation in which some species are given great significance because they can engineer ecosystems in desired ways. The other dimension to rewilding is that it has quite an ambitious idea of time. So rather than thinking about short-term extinction processes, rewilders are happy to cast their minds further back in time to think about what kind of baselines would be appropriate for designing an ecological intervention. What should nature look like in Europe? What should nature look like in North America if we could cast our eyes further back? So one high-profile paper published in 2006, which was advocating rewilding North America, looked at the large herbivores and large carnivores that used to be present on the North American continent tens of thousands of years ago, and then looked at those which had gone extinct and looked for equivalents of those animals that were still present in other parts of the world. So there used to be something a bit like an elephant in North America. There are no elephants in North America now. So the argument was, why don't we go and find an elephant from Africa, bring it to North America, and it could serve the same function that elephants used to serve in this landscape. So on the one hand, you've got this sort of retrospective temporality going back in the past to find functional ecosystems you could emulate, but there's also this kind of engineering future in which you could move species around the world because they produce similar functions, even if they're not authentic American elephants, let's say. So there's sort of interesting ideas of time at work in this rewilding movement. Perhaps the most high profile of these types of experiments is a project suggested by two Russian scientists, Sergei and Nikita Zimov, father and son, who took control of a large area of Siberia after the collapse of the Soviet Republic, the USSR, and they've been managing this as a research station in Siberia, and they're particularly concerned about what's happening to this site due to climate change, and climate change is leading to the melting of the permafrost and the potential release of large amounts of methane into the atmosphere, which could have this kind of runaway effect on climate change. And their proposal is that one of the problems with this site is that it's missing these really large herbivores that used to trample down the snow. And in trampling down the snow, they create this insulating blanket of snow that would stop the melting of the permafrost. And so their proposal is to try and bring back these large herbivores in order to trample down the snow to create this blanket to prevent the melting of the permafrost and the release of what they call the methane bomb. And the appropriate tool for this is the mammoth, they argue. So the woolly mammoth that used to be common across Siberia, and many mammoth skeletons emerge out of the permafrost. And so they are trying to drum up support for some kind of what's called de-extinction program. So a kind of Jurassic Park type genetic experiment in which you could bring back the mammoth by inserting mammoth DNA into an Asian elephant to bring back this mammoth. And it's a fairly far-fetched project. It's unlikely to happen. But what's interesting is it's proposed to us as a tool for fighting global warming. So we get this idea that a particular species, the mammoth, could have planetary scale impacts on the concentration of gases in the atmosphere. So this is the kind of planetary keystone species that could be used to engineer atmospheric dynamics. Yeah, so it's a kind of nice way of capturing that idea of using life to manage life to secure desired services and functions. Okay, so that's the second dimension. The third dimension is that we need to think carefully about the role of people within these projects. So there's a strand of rewilding which is quite sort of eco-modernist. It's about humans as, if you like, hyper keystone species that we can think and design and manage these projects. And this will involve sort of active forms of management. But there's also another version of it, which is in some ways interested in what happens if people disappear. There are passive processes associated with land abandonment that also lead to forms of rewilding. And rewilding can happen under very different models of control, if you like. So perhaps the most high-profile example of a very active model of land management for rewilding comes from the Netherlands, and this site called the Oostvaardersplassen, which is a polder landscape just outside of Amsterdam. So a polder, it's been reclaimed from the sea. It's part of the largest artificial island in the world, the Flevoland province. And much of it, as you can see, is agriculture or suburbs. It's just outside of Amsterdam. But there's this section of it, which they never quite fixed the drainage on. It was going to be an oil refinery, but then the oil crisis in the 1970s meant that they didn't build it, and it was largely abandoned. And it became colonized initially by migratory birds, by geese. And it became a subject of scientific study and monitoring. And a group of Dutch ecologists got very interested in whether we might take this site as a laboratory for what would have happened to Europe at the end of the last ice ages. So with the end of the ice sheets, you had lots of bare ground revealed, and they wanted to make the case that ecosystem at the end in Europe at the end of the last ice ages would have been controlled by a guild of what they call large herbivores, so wild cattle, wild horses, deer, that would have grazed this landscape and created a much more open landscape than we tend to think of. We tend to think of Europe as a closed canopy forest. The trees will grow back. And they were saying, well, actually, in the presence of lots of large herbivores, you'd have a much more open, dynamic landscape of forest and pasture. So they introduced these backbred cattle and horses, and they ran this experiment to see what happened. And this is an ongoing project. But the key thing is it's very much controlled. This is a site below sea level. They have to pump the water out or else it would flood. And yet it's offered up to us as what's described as the Serengeti behind the dikes. This is a kind of little bit of Africa in the Netherlands. It's kind of interesting ideas about creating wildness, but through, in a very Dutch way, through kind of engineering logics of control. And the flip side to this, just by way of example, is places like the abandoned territory around the Chernobyl nuclear reactor in the Ukraine. And people will know the story. There was a significant nuclear disaster in the late 1980s. The site was evacuated, and it's largely been left to be recolonized by natural processes. So the vegetation grew back, the wolves have returned, the feral dogs have returned, and it's increasingly of interest to conservationists looking at what happens in a kind of world without us. So in a world that has a disaster in which you have these very unplanned, uncontrolled succession practices, many of these animals can survive in highly radioactive situations because they tend to get eaten before they get cancer, and such that you can actually have this as a kind of accidental ecology. So two very contrasting examples of both an active model of rewilding and a passive model of rewilding. And then the fourth dimension, just to pick out here in relation to rewilding as an approach, is it has quite ambitious ideas about spatial scale. So there's a real interest here in thinking in terms of landscapes and thinking about landscapes as inhabited by different non-human organisms and different processes that are connected along their own geographies. So there's great interest in connectivity and in some ways thinking like a beaver or thinking like a wolf, to think about how you might design ways in which organisms might move through particular landscapes. So some of the organizations like Rewilding Europe here have these very ambitious sort of continental scale visions of what a future Europe might look like. Organizations like Rewilding Europe are particularly excited about the processes of land abandonment that are underway in some marginal agricultural areas of Europe. And they see this as an opportunity for reintroducing, translocating, restoring organisms, but also enabling their movement either through putting them in the back of a van and taking them somewhere else, or by building these ecological corridors that would connect different sites to other places. The Dutch are all over this. They're very keen on ecological networks and planning ecological networks to design forms of connectivity, both within the nation, and then this is obviously part of a wider European network that would connect into Belgium and into Germany and into France. But this whole idea is that you could design what they call an ecological main structure. You could design connections along bits of infrastructure such that desirable organisms can move through the landscape. They've been building these eco-ducts, bottom right, which are bridges over main roads, but they're bridges for wildlife. So they just build a wild strip along the top, and it allows organisms to spread through the landscape in this way. Okay, so a kind of ambitious idea that conservation shouldn't just be in particular bounded nature reserves, that we might think about conservation in networks. We might think about flows of organisms through landscapes and to enable that to take place. Okay, so if you like, if we turn now to some more pragmatic and specific consequences of rewilding for cities and for urban design and planning, what I've tried to do is just pick out 9 guidelines, if you like, 9 sort of provocations that those of you who have the joy of being more practical in the work that you do might sort of think about or want to respond to. So the first of which, I guess, and this speaks, I suppose, to a very prevalent idea in the West that cities are lost to nature, cities are for people, and nature's out there in the countryside or in the wilderness, is to recognize the fact that a lot of cities are very ecologically rich and diverse places. So this is London from the air, with a sort of filter on it to really draw out the green spaces, and you see, I guess, the quantity of green space within the city on different spatial scales. And these are both sort of discrete territories within the city, parks, but also these really interesting networks within the city of railways and canals and rivers and other bits of infrastructure that connect the city out to the wider countryside. So there's just a sense that actually cities aren't as lost and degraded and grey as we might think them to be, that there are already important fragments of biodiversity within cities. And increasingly in countries like the UK, where we've had this pretty substantial industrialization of the countryside, we've lost a lot of biodiversity on the farming landscape, and the cities are the places where these fragments survive because they haven't been subject to the same processes of transformation. And particular hotspots emerge in London and elsewhere, like graveyards. And London has this amazing collection of Victorian graveyards, many of which, because we've lived in austerity for some time, have largely been abandoned and undermanaged, and so they've been colonized by all sorts of weird and wonderful species, and create these very exciting places for wildlife to exist within. We could think also about the presence of particular charismatic species within the city. So London has a substantial fox population that's grown quite substantially over the last few years. There's more foxes, they estimate, in cities now than there are in the countryside, and that these organisms have found ways of living within the city, largely untroubling urban residents, and they've created their own geographies and ways of moving around the city that tell us something about how animals come to inhabit and make their homes in urban environments. Okay, so there's a sort of, there's a basic audit of what's there. Then the second element, I guess, we get from rewilding is that an awful lot of what we know about emergent properties of ecological systems have not come from closely designed scientific experiments. They've come from these surprising accidents, like the Chernobyl disaster, or even the Usslarstassen example, that have told us something about how life functions. And so there's a range of places around the world that have been subject to forms of deurbanization, of urban collapse. Detroit is the place that people often point to, and you get these, slightly, I think, unsavory forms of almost kind of pornographic urban ruin photography. But nonetheless, what we've seen in some deindustrializing cities in the global north is the resurgence of life within cities, and the ways in which urban ecologies create these novel ecosystems, these ecosystems that don't have an analog in the countryside. They're a sort of mixture of species that humans brought into the city, species that have naturally colonized from the wider environment, but they create these very interesting ecosystems, sometimes growing in these brownfield post-industrial settings. This is a site called Canvey Island in the southeast of the UK. It's a former oil refinery, and it has quite a rare set of habitats in the UK, which are these sort of dry, gravelly, stony habitats, which were recently discovered to hold the highest concentration of a particular type of plant and insect biodiversity in the UK. And it produced this movement that wanted to designate this site as a national nature reserve, wanted to create this idea that this is a site of ecological significance that we should place alongside the Lake District and the Scottish Highlands as a site of importance. And it was sort of provocative because it got people thinking about how aesthetics kind of shape what people think nature are, rather than the actual ecological composition of these places. So this was supposed to be Britain's brownfield rainforest, but there are accidental ecologies that have come about here by virtue of the histories of industry, but also the histories of trade that brought these organisms to this site, that give us a kind of fresh take on urban biodiversity. And then we have a whole range in the UK of what are described, depending on your sort of political persuasion, as non-native, invasive, foreign, exotic species. So species that have found their way here through the pet trade, through the gardening trade, through accidental imports on the other networks of globalization. One high-profile example of which are these ring-necked parakeets, which are not indigenous to the UK, but have taken up residence in gardens and forests in parts of the southeast of England. They're very charismatic, they're very colourful, they're very noisy, and they have people who are very fond of them and people who aren't. But there's a sense here that the UK, amongst those who are keen on these species, is a node in a global network of exchange. And as much as we're a node in a global network of the exchange of goods and people, we're a node in a global network of exchange of different species, and we should realize this. We should celebrate this, and in some ways, the diversity of the city reflects the diversity of the people who live in the city and the histories of trade and colonization and such like. So there's a kind of interesting cultural way in which nation, nativeness, and nature get aligned together in discussions about what the wild is and what belongs in particular places. Okay, and then there's a range of work that you guys will know much more about than I do, which is about deliberate interventions to create habitat within the built fabric of the city, or what sometimes gets called habitecture. So these are kind of design interventions that might create hospitable conditions for desired forms of wildlife in the city, and these happen across a range of spatial scales, different efforts to try and visualize the urban fabric as a place that already accommodates different species, but could also be made more hospitable to non-human life through nest boxes, through changing gardening practices, through, I guess, encouraging people to be a bit more observant about the speed that they move through the city or the ways that they manage their waste. And this is certainly something, I don't know if it's true in the worlds that you live in, has become much more prominent during lockdown conditions, where people are being confined to their homes. People have had to become more observant of the much more mundane life that lives around them in particular cities. And there's been this proliferation of lockdown nature enthusiasm taking place on social media and elsewhere, as people have sort of turned their attention to the much less charismatic components of the urban fabric in that way. There are a set of artists and architects working on, if you like, portable solutions to these types of urban design initiatives. This is a sort of deadwood, or something that will become a deadwood repository for beetles and birds and mining bees. Sort of aesthetic bits of architecture that could be brought into the urban fabric. So one could create habitat, and then of course there are various ways in which particular desired species can be introduced, can be translocated from one place to another, as they've done with wolves in some sites, as they've done with beavers in other sites. Clearly it would be hard to introduce wolves or beavers into cities like London, but there are efforts to bring in wild seed mixes, for example, that would create a more diverse ecology in a garden. This is what's called a living roof on top of the headquarters of a large supermarket company in the Docklands in London, and it transpired this was created in the 1990s. This has become a hotspot for what are called parachuting spiders. So these are spiders that travel by making a web and sending it up and catching the wind, and they drift in the wind and they land somewhere else. And if you imagine London is an estuary, and the estuary acts as a bit of a funnel, so things sort of blow down the estuary and they funnel down the estuary and they land in the city. So organisms coming across from the continent, coming across from Europe, get blown across, and these parachuting spiders being one example, and they land in the city. And so this has become this sort of perverse hotspot for these parachuting spiders right in the urban downtown heartland of the London Docklands. So you can both nurture the potential for introductions to take root, as well as potentially introducing particular species that would have desired functions within the city. This is a similar type of architectural intervention in which you create living walls rather than living roofs, and you can create self-sustaining ecological communities that are, in this case, very aesthetic, but potentially have some functional use in terms of creating insulation, creating sites for biodiversity in the city. This is on Edgware Road in London, so it's sort of right in the centre of London. Clearly, they're expensive to make, and not for everybody in terms of maintenance, but they do have this ability of sort of engineering wildness into the city in particular ways. And then if we switch from the more proactive design interventions towards ways of just creating more space for wildlife to thrive in the city which don't involve design, there's been a movement amongst urban conservationists to try and encourage people to be a bit less tidy in their everyday practices on a range of spatial scales, but particularly in the UK, we had a great enthusiasm for gardening programs on TV and a great enthusiasm for a kind of modernist garden design where everything was neat and tidy, everything would be put away. You'd have astroturf, you'd have plastic grass. You would very much minimise the mess and diversity in your garden and in your park. And this led particularly to the demise of dead wood, so dead trees, which is very important for a range of insect species, dead wood loving species. And so there was a big push to try and encourage gardeners to be a bit less tidy, to create log piles, to legitimate the idea that just because your garden looked messy didn't mean you were negligent, that this was a proactive kind of ecological sensibility towards gardening. And a lot of this was hinged on this flagship species called the Stag Beetle, which has to spend 5 years of its life in dead wood before it emerges for 3 months as this very charismatic beetle that flies around. And so they designed various nest boxes that you'd fill with dead wood and plant in the ground. But ultimately, the idea is that you'd have more dead wood lying around in the landscape. Okay. And then if we think about that fourth dimension of rewilding, about trying to think the city through the lens of a particular non-human, trying to imagine an urban animal geography, and to begin to map connectivity and enable movement. So there was a group that quite successfully advocated for London to be designated a national park, and they had London designated as the first urban national park a few years ago. And a lot of that initial work was about mapping networks. It was trying to think the city from the perspective of different organisms that might or might not want to make their home in the city. And they produced a set of colourful diagrams, but also tried to think through some design interventions for those involved in infrastructure projects. How would you enable wildlife to flourish, in amongst the kind of boundaries and territories of the city? Okay. And then alongside thinking about connectivity, a lot of the rewilding movement is about thinking with processes. It's thinking about changes over different times and different spatial scales. Much of which are challenging, I'm sure, for urban designers and architects, where you want to keep certain things under control, you want to keep certain things in abeyance. But London and the Netherlands in particular, which are sites that are close to sea level and are anticipated to be increasingly threatened by sea level rises, are trying to think through ways of living with water rather than controlling water. And this is a site that's been flooded. This isn't a site that's living with water. But the Dutch in particular have been experimenting with ways in which you might move towards more floating cities that could allow rivers and ecological systems to have a bit more dynamism within them, and that humans would learn to live with natural processes rather than continually controlling and suppressing natural processes, to allow these processes to have some agency in the way that urban life took place. The Dutch example, most famous Dutch example, is on the River Rhine, which is a big river that runs through the Netherlands. And the Rhine used to be very tightly canalized, it was very tightly controlled, and the water was just accelerated through the Netherlands to get it to the sea. And that works so long as the sea is ready to take the water, but if the sea is too high, then the water backs up and it floods over the dikes. And so what they've been doing is widening the floodplain but also giving the river much more agency to carve its own channel on the floodplains. It's called the Making Space for Rivers project, and it involves in some way sacrificing some areas of agriculture and settlement. But the philosophy is that if you give more space to rivers to choose their own course, they'll have more capacity to buffer extreme flood events because they can channel the energy out into the floodplain rather than pushing it down the channel. And again, the Dutch have designed this, being very good at water engineering in ways that they can maximize the availability of the floodplain while still securing particular settlements and agriculture along the way. And then there's a range of, I guess, smaller scale interventions that try and use passive heating, try and enable biodiversity to flourish in particular situations where you could allow natural processes to drive what grew in the garden, what grew on the house in ways that are, I guess, fairly mainstream now in terms of environmental thinking as it's come to shape architectural practice. Okay, and then finally is to think along different spatial scales, if you like. So one of the arguments that I make in the probiotic turn is that we need to think about the connections of life from the microbial to the macro. And there is this growing interest in the urban microbiome, or the microbiome of the built environment, the ways in which microbes both threaten the security of urban spaces and urban materials, but also that cities are places in which the majority of people live, and they're the places in which the majority of people receive their microbial exposure and their microbial colonization. So there've been a range of proposals put out for what's called the urban microbiome rewilding hypothesis. So the idea is that we might think constructively about how the spaces that we create in cities would lead to desired forms of microbial exposure for urban citizens. So the idea is that there are desirable microbes in the soil that children in particular might want to get exposure to. And you might facilitate that through some form of design intervention that would plant the right types of plants, create the right sorts of soil, so that over the life course of an urban citizen, they might pick up the right types of microbial colonization. There is a massive hole in the knowledge base as to what that might look like. We don't necessarily know what a normal microbiome of the urban should look like, and nor do we know the kind of key points in the life course of an individual where they get their microbial exposure. But we do know that it's significant in terms of calibrating people's immune systems towards allergy, autoimmune, inflammatory disease. So this is very much on the kind of frontier of urban rewilding, is to start to think about the micro as well as the macro and how they're connected to each other. Okay, so those would be my 9 guidelines. Actually, no, I've got one more. Sorry, that was 8. And the 9th one is to think through the ways in which contemporary sites are haunted by the absence of important species. So rewilding rests on the idea that there are keystone species that organize ecologies. Many of those keystone species are either globally extinct or locally extinct, and their absence leads to imbalances within the functions of particular ecosystems. So George Monbiot, who's a Guardian British left-leaning environmental columnist, talks about how much of the vegetation in the UK would have evolved in the presence of rhinos and elephants. So rhinos and elephants have been common over the longer paleoecological history of the UK. We obviously don't have them in the wild here now, but hedgerow species, so these are species that we use to have hedges around our gardens in cities, often have this ability to regenerate when they get smashed down, because Monbiot and ecologists argue they evolved in the presence of elephants that were forever smashing them down. And so we can think about the particular properties of contemporary species coming about because they evolved in the presence of absent organisms that are no longer there. And so thinking with these absences both helps to justify reinstructions, but also helps to understand some of the dysfunctions that might come into urban ecosystems. Okay, Monbiot makes this argument in his book Feral. Okay, so those are 9 guidelines. I'm conscious I've been talking for a long time now. I have some what we'd call challenges, if you like, for urban rewilding. I don't know whether it'd be worth me spelling those out now, or whether you've all had enough, and it'd be good to turn to some questions. I don't know, Elif, what do you think?
I think we can continue. I mean, I personally didn't have enough, so we can definitely continue. Thanks so much.
Okay, well, I'll move through these fairly quickly. So I've given a pretty positive account of what rewilding could do for cities in terms of greening cities and tackling a range of problems. But clearly, it's not that straightforward, and there are obstacles and challenges to how this might be implemented. The reasons why lots of wildlife disappeared from the city was because wildlife threatened property and threatened human health. And there remain, animals and organisms that we want to be wary about reintroducing in the city, animals and organisms that are making their own way back into cities that are posing challenges to urban residents and urban governance. One charismatic example is the wild boar that has really resurged in Europe over the last 20, 30 years due to declining hunting pressure, due to changes in agricultural practice. So there are many boar now living in big cities in Berlin and Barcelona have resident urban boar populations, and boar are quite aggressive territorial animals, and they cause challenges for urban residents and people involved in urban pest control. Perhaps more significantly are organisms like the mosquito, if you like, which are responsible for killing many people in many parts of the world. Mosquitoes thrive in poorly drained cities. If rewilding is in some ways about re-wetting cities, we'd need to think carefully about how you would return water to the city in a way that didn't create conditions conducive to mosquitoes and other pathogens in that way. In parts of the world which are very dry, the return of vegetation to the city can create substantial fire risk. I mean, we've seen this a lot in California and Australia and places like that, where suburban enthusiasms for nature can lead to particular types of plants and particular types of burning practice that can create these hotspots for fire, which clearly threaten health and property in that way. The second challenge is a more political challenge around aesthetics. So I think, as I've mentioned along the way, there's a particular aesthetic to some strands of urban design, which is about order, it's about tidiness, it's about in some ways demonstrating human control over natural processes. And yet a lot of rewilding is about mess, it's about abundance, it's about diversity, rather than about simplicity and order. And there is a concern amongst some rewilding enthusiasts that when nature gets introduced into the city, it gets very much introduced on human terms. We get this sort of greenwashing where it's, mature trees and flat grass. And that's fine because it's great for recreation. It's not great for biodiversity, really. There's not an awful lot that thrives in a sort of monoculture of grass and a few, temperate trees. And in some ways, you'd want to have a much more messy landscape, which doesn't always help sell high-end condominiums in the way that people might want them to look like. Another example, this is a piece from the Telegraph, which is a sort of right of centre UK newspaper complaining about the popularity of rewilding and people's enthusiasms for sort of messy gardening that were threatening property prices. Estate agents warn that rewilding mini meadows are damaging property prices, that the sort of the well-meaning people who want nice mown lawns and white picket fences are appalled at the rise of rewilding because it's jeopardizing property in the suburbs in that way. And this is a fashion that may well shift, but nonetheless, you could see how those aesthetics would play out in particular locations. I guess maybe more profoundly, the idea of the probiotic turn is that we learn to value particular organisms that have this keystone status, this ability to reset ecologies and to deliver ecosystem services. And it tends to therefore hold up quite a narrow subset of organisms that are useful, if you like. And, the archetype being the beaver. The beaver is this sort of hardworking water engineer that turns up on time, doesn't need to be paid, doesn't take a holiday, et cetera, et cetera. There's a kind of valorization of work, but would make, in some ways, the survival of organisms conditional on them being useful and working hard. There's a lot of stuff in the world that isn't useful and doesn't work very hard for us. Does that not have a place in a kind of probiotic model of urban design. Do we need to make space for the lazy, make space for the redundant, rather than just optimizing around the useful in certain ways? And then there are familiar challenges to do with who gets to benefit from going probiotic. There's a very patchy geography as to where in the world these things are happening. And when we think about this in an urban context, we need to think about who has access to these green spaces, who has the social economic capital in order to engage in these kind of design interventions, and a real risk that they facilitate processes of what's called green gentrification. Perhaps the most high profile being the High Line in New York. This is an abandoned railroad that used to run through parts of the Lower East Side of New York. And there's the restoration of the High Line into this very glitzy consumerist walking experience has propelled the gentrification of a part of Manhattan that comes with all the benefits and the drawbacks of gentrification that have been well studied by urban geographers. Okay, so just to conclude then, I guess what I've been saying in the book is, and in the talk, is that there is this probiotic turn underway in how life is being conceived and managed, happening in response to the blowback of the Anthropocene, and it's happening across a range of different scales. And it's beginning to touch down in the urban and in ideas about urban design and architecture. We see a growing appetite for urban ecology amongst public planners and developers. There are lots of good reasons, not just kind of reasons that are good for nature, but also good for us as to why we might want wildlife in our cities. There's a growing body of expertise and experience to start to rewild cities. But also we need to think about how rewilding comes in different forms. It has the potential to benefit some, but the potential to expose others to particular risks. It's clearly going to be a challenging process. It involves unraveling a great deal of what's been celebrated about cities for some time, this control over nature, the release from the drudgery and the risks of rural living. Rewilding in some ways asks us to have some profound questions about what it means to be urban, what it means to live in the city. And it's going to inevitably be an important political process that will involve deliberation and working through with different relevant stakeholders. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you very much for your time, and we can open up for discussion.
Thank you so much for this incredibly illuminating and inspiring presentation. We have been discussing some of the issues in the context of Istanbul, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions from our students and from everybody else who's interested. So thanks a lot. Okay.
Can I start?
Yes, please do.
Thank you, Jamie, for this wildly interesting conversation. So I have two questions. One is about the politics of it. So you have sort of shown us, you've showed us that the different scale interventions of rewilding, right, from the continental state and then the nation state and then regional cityscape, the smaller interventions, small scale interventions. But in terms of like undertaking these projects, I'm interested in the governance or sovereignty issues, more political sort of agency. So where do you see that? Because when you show the image for the Rewilding Europe, right, it only shows the continent and it includes the European part of Turkey, whereas it doesn't include Anatolia. I mean, to me, that is in itself an issue, right? If this is a planetary scale problem and we're dealing with it. So sort of what are the sort of political agencies that might be involved in this undertaking? And the second question is... Can I
take that one? Can I take that one first? Because I'll forget that question before you ask the next one. So it's a great question, and there's an awful lot to be said about it. And clearly, it's about different spatial scales. The rewilding vision, to a certain extent, is about getting access to the wilds to the east of Europe. A lot of the enthusiasm came about after the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and essentially all these big beasts out there east how can we sort of tempt them back into Western Europe? And so that's involved, some kind of interesting geopolitical conversations about the movement. And specifically to the Turkish question, I don't know how they draw those lines on the map. Somebody somewhere decided that was where Europe stopped, and we know that's a very fraught decision in terms of who gets to draw those lines and where those lines are drawn. I think if we think about it on a smaller scale, like many of these decisions, it's about questions of land ownership and the sovereignty over land. And what we've seen, at least in the rewilding projects, as is often the case with new conservation projects, is they've happened in large land ownings, often owned by one private individual. So rewilding has been propelled by these group of philanthropists who've inherited wealth, often sort of second generation industrialists who have come into a fortune, and they've bought big tracts of land, and they've decided that they're going to run a rewilding experiment. And it's very easy for them because they own the land, and they don't have to let people in. There are some examples of more common property models of ownership where the land is held in common and this happens. But if we think about it into the city, I guess the nature of land ownership in cities is often very fragmented, at least in Western cities. So any kind of coherent vision of connectivity often rests on an aggregation of sovereignty, but by private landowners. At the same time, infrastructure is often owned by the state, and so those sort of networks there's often a single owner of the railways or the roads or the rivers, and so there are, if you like, other political geographies of ownership that can enable some forms of connectivity to take place.
Thank
Second
you.
Question.
Yes, second question. It seems to me the project of rewilding is mostly about non-human animals. But how can it be? How can we talk about rewilding without looking at our own species and changing the behavior on our own species in that sense? So can you comment on that? Because I'm thinking, so yes, let's bring back the benchmark and the animal species from Africa introduce it to Europe. But what about, so in terms of the ecological sort of impact, so shall we thinking about going back in time and bringing the Homo erectus? I know it's a funny question, but yeah, I'm wondering what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's lots of different ways of answering it, I suppose. One kind of ecological way of answering it is to start to think about humans as ecological agents in a way that many of the species that we coexist with would have evolved with us, rather than thinking us as somehow outside of nature and we just need to sort of stay away, the kind of wilderness model, to think about the fact that organisms co-evolved with us. The other way in on the microbial side, and it gets quite fraught, is this idea that there are, if you like, there is what's called an evolutionary adapted environment that humans would have evolved in, and that we would once have been commonly colonized by a particular subset of microbial life prior to domestication or prior to the advent of urban life. And this is what, if you like, the natural human microbiome should look like. And if we could only restore that, we'd get back to some kind of harmonious health in ourselves. And there's extensions of that say, well, we used to live in a much more violent civilization, and therefore violence is normal and natural. And there's a whole kind of paleo-primitivist version of that, which gets quite dark and quite libertarian in some forms. And you see that within versions of the rewilding movement. But the sort of mainstream immunological science suggests that we could usefully differentiate between what are called old friend microbes. So these are microbes that most humans would have had long-term exposure to, and then a more recent set of what are called crowd infections that have come about in human terms quite recently as we've begun to live in densely packed urban civilizations. And they'd be things like cholera and dysentery, while the old friend microbes would be soil microbes or these helminths, these parasitic worms that we evolved with. And so the challenge for rewilding is to give us back the old friends while avoiding the crowd infections, which seems quite straightforward, but it's clearly not that easy to facilitate. But so there is definitely a human dimension, both in terms of thinking of the human as an organism that is an ecology. There is a kind of behavioral psychology element to it, which I haven't really ventured into. It doesn't tend to leave you in very pleasant places, it's fair to say, politically, but nonetheless, it's something that we should be aware of. And then there's the kind of wider ecological story of the human as this kind of top predator, if you like, and what that might mean for understanding the dynamics of other forms of life in an ecosystem.
Thank you.
Yes, please, Melis, go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much, Jamie, for this really interesting presentation. It's very comprehensive. I'm just going to maybe tackle a question from the perspective maybe of conservation, as I'm working in a bit in that field, and also maybe pushing further the politics questions that Zeynep was talking about, right? So okay, so I'm just gonna I'm a little bit puzzled by where the whole dynamic of maybe global south, global north comes into this, really, in terms of especially the colonial histories. Let me give you a very specific example, because my work is on basically community forests and village forests and carbon offsetting. And I work in West Africa and East Africa. And recently I've been in Tanzania, just to follow up on the previous research. So what I came across there is a lot of new projects, specifically by Dutch government, who is pushing for wildlife corridors in Tanzania. Right, so I'm just looking at this really, kind of sleek projects that they implement in Netherlands, and I'm really kind of puzzled by how this translates to Tanzania as a wildlife corridor projects, which is very much the kind of coming back with this control command kind of conservation, which and also they're also promoting this kind of reintroduction of more like a permaculture in Africa, for example, and they look completely different. And I bet it could be the case for Turkey as well, because they enter into contact these kinds of projects or ideas in a way with a specific context and institutional, I would say infrastructure, right? So this raises for me a lot of questions about, colonial relationships and how rewilding might play a role in them, or might be hijacked in a certain way. It could be, an unintended consequence, or maybe even sometimes intended ones. That's my first question in terms of concrete examples of how this translates in other places. And the other maybe more general question is that, okay, I feel, I support this, at least I'm sympathetic to this idea of a messiness, an introduction of new, old friends, old species and all of that. It's really an important one, but I'm also very concerned about the idea of modernism and control and design of aspect of it, which I think is engineering aspect, if you like, engineering of wildlife in this project, which becomes in which way this is accidental. For example, when you talk about Chernobyl and the accidental growth of wildlife in Chernobyl, for me, it's not accidental. It just depends on in which way, in which scale you're looking at, and if you're thinking of Anthropocene as Capitalocene or not, if you know what I mean, and in which way this is not modernist. It's a general question. That's it.
Fantastic, thank you. Two great observations and questions. I mean, you're very right about the colonial histories and neo-colonial present of how the probiotic turn is playing out. Both in terms of conservation and in terms of carbon sequestration. We see this big push towards resetting the global carbon balance, increasingly through what are called nature-based solutions, which is, going after cheap carbon, and the cheap carbon tends to be found in places where, land is cheap and life is cheap. And so we'd be able to see those things happening, and those are understood well, I think, by political ecologists working on some of these schemes, and likewise the history of wildlife conservation and the pursuit of wilderness, particularly in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, has often been premised on denying the histories of indigenous land use, denying the histories of colonial land clearance that led to the creation of these reserves. And in particular, I think if we're thinking about it in relation to this flourishing of wildlife in temperate regions in North America and in Europe, much of that has been enabled by the globalization of agriculture. So the reason why farming is marginal in parts of Europe is because we've outsourced food and forestry production to parts of the tropics. So we're seeing, if you like, a net de-wilding of parts of Indonesia, of parts of South America, of parts of Africa, even as we're seeing potentially a net rewilding of the north. And whether there's a global increase in wildness is a sort of question that we could discuss, but it has this very stark and unequal geography that I get into a bit in the latter chapters of the book. So they're really important things to hold on to across a range of spatial scales, not just within the city, if you like, but on these sort of more international scales of international development.
Yeah,
I think the control.
Sorry. Just a small bit in there is in terms of like offsetting, particularly. Also, this is
Yeah. The control question is fascinating. I mean, I think those who are advocating rewilding in the Netherlands wouldn't necessarily see it as a counter-modern project. They'd see it as a form of ecological modernism. So it's a sort of greening of the modern project. There's a Dutch philosopher, Joseph Coulertz, who describes rewilding as the controlled decontrolling of ecological controls, which sounds like an oxymoron, but actually when you think about it, it sort of makes sense. It's a controlled decontrolling. So it's still ultimately humans who are in charge. We're just recalibrating the scientific tools and the technological tools in order to allow a degree of emergence. But the allowance is on human terms. And I guess people have warned about nuclear disasters ever since the nuclear bomb was created. So you could say it was a problem that was baked into nuclear energy from the start, Chernobyl. So it's still ultimately a kind of, albeit unintended, consequence of modernity. I don't think it's necessarily planned, and that we couldn't describe it as an accident. It certainly wasn't designed as an ecological experiment, if you like. That it has now emerged as a site for ecological experimentation is interesting. It's clearly not how you want to start a conservation program. We need to contaminate the entirety of the region so that no people can live there. But nonetheless, it did allow these forms of knowledge to come into existence. But I'd agree that it's not counter-modern. It's a sort of new version of modernity that has a kind of ecological principle at its core.
I mean, for me, just it just presents very important challenges and political challenges in terms of especially offsetting projects, like rewilding. It could be that just to offset carbon, there would be more rewilding projects in the global south, and they might create huge amounts of problems from how I see it. That's what was a little bit alarming to me, if you like. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the comment and for extending the discussion to a post-colonial context as well. That's obviously an issue to definitely think about. Any other questions for following up this one, or other questions?
Especially our students. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, generally very shy. Yes, go ahead.
I have a
Thank you.
question.
Sure.
First of all, thank you so much, Jamie. It was really inspiring and very informative. And also, I don't know, at least for me, bringing some hope to this state of crisis that we're living in today, in terms of Anthropocene, of course. I have this one question. It's kind of an existential question. I mean, you just said, or it was mentioned, that it's not possible to leave the human beings as an organism out of the equation, of course, but human beings as an economical, political force, or an organism that, you know, really invades the whole of the planet in their economical, you know, functions. I think that's a great issue, and you know, think about this industrial farming and you know all these cattle and all these livestock that humans are breeding today. That monocultural, you know, practice of our existence. And when I think about how a great deal of wildlife is now going extinct as we speak, and we are going towards the 6th mass extinction that the planet Earth has ever seen. Do you think it's possible to have an impact on this you know, current state of crisis that we're in, this rewilderness, you know, rewilding the cities? This idea, can it have an impact? What do you think?
It's a big question. I mean, I want to be optimistic. I sort of feel that we need some kind of stories about the future that give us some optimism. I mean, you sense that it's a very critical juncture at the moment. I mean, the diagnosis of environmental problems has been going on, you know, for all of my lifetime, you know, 40+ years, and you know, things are perhaps better than they were, but they're not in any way on a course that would lead to sustainability. Yeah, there's definitely examples that one can point to on different scales where life has been enabled to be better for humans and wildlife through these types of ecological interventions. But it rubs up against some, you know, profound drivers of the capitalist system, in which, you know, we are encouraged to use more stuff and to pursue a model of economic growth premised on growth. And it's hard to see that fitting within, you know, the concepts of planetary boundaries that are used to kind of conceive of the Anthropocene and how it might be headed off. So I think, you know, I end up in the book quite skeptical about the claims of the sort of mainstream model of probiotics, which is this ecological modernization model, which, you know, hopes we can largely continue with business as usual. We just need to substitute fossil fuel energy for renewable energy, but we can still have growth and the increasing throughput of stuff. It's just decoupled from the material footprint on the planet. And this is in some ways the most significant question if we're thinking about sustainable development goals, or we think about sustainable development, is how can you redistribute the benefits of growth to all the people who haven't had the benefits of growth, while at the same time enabling growth that doesn't undermine the conditions of planetary survival. Any audit of what's going on an annual basis, even with all the disruptions of COVID, suggests we're not going in the right direction. So whether I'm naive, I don't know. I sort of think, you know, I have to hold on to something. You know, there are definitely strands of environmentalism that think grief or apocalypse might be a more compelling ethical sensibility. I just find it quite hard to get out of bed if that's what my job was, like, as an educator, is to tell people we're all doomed.
All right, thank you so much.
Yes, please, Melody.
Hello, thank you, Jamie and Elif, also for this wonderful rewilding session. and I'm a little bit with a construction sound, so hopefully I'm not taking to unmute. And I just want to ask, so in sustainable living, rewilding is taking a really crucial part. And for our future, especially, we have to think from now. And I really wonder about your thoughts or the university's approach, especially, of the unconnection of the human nature with nature. So, your thoughts.
Okay. So I guess, I mean, the idea of human nature, one could interpret through a number of different perspectives. I mean, by that, do you mean the kind of material nature of the human in terms of what we eat and, you know, what kind of microbes we're exposed to? Or is it more of a sort of psychological question that there is a kind of natural way of being in the world that we're alienated from? And maybe you could say a little bit more about what you understand that idea of human nature to be.
Yeah, like both of the parts, somehow a little bit like psychologically or educationally, I can say, or way of approach of the human mind. And as you said, the life creates conditions conducive to life. So as you have mentioned, so that's why we have a bio-inspired approach lesson in Bilgi University. And so that's why I'm asking about the, like, how was your thought, especially with the university's approach of the rewilding with the human nature? Because as you said, like controlling the uncontrolled, so it can be like a cycle. So it should be like a sustainable way of looking. So that's why I was a little bit more curious about the educational approach somehow.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure I have a particularly well formulated answer for you. I mean, one of the, I guess, the challenges for the types of thinking that informs probiotic rewilding approach is it's a very kind of holistic way of thinking about the relationships between different entities. And, you know, ecology has sort of battled and grappled with the idea of whether it can do holism or whether it's better to be much more reductionist and to pick up on particular components of the system. And much of the science that we have and the forms of evidence that we count tends to depend on quite reductionist models of proof, if you like, you know, the clinical trial, the laboratory experiments, you know, even the kind of field study needs to have a kind of clear hypothesis to test and a range of ways of knowing, if you like, which, you know, for better or worse, are the kind of gold standard in science. And some of the scientists who I spoke to in this book sort of struggled in a way with the way that they were constrained to do the type of holistic thinking that would be associated with kind of earth system science or these new ecological approaches to immunology, because they had to produce certain truths that were hard to produce about the phenomenon they're interested in. And they weren't even getting into the kind of more spiritual, psychological dimensions as to how kind of human well-being could be captured in that kind of model. So I think epistemologically, there are some quite profound challenges that have, you know, been well known in the history of science as to how more holistic, more relational ways of knowing could be evidenced and made to count in a modern reductionist kind of framework of knowledge generation. And you know, it's moving in that direction, and it's moving in part because the technology has got better to be able to model and simulate this. So quite a bit has come out of the rise of sort of machine learning and big data algorithms. Isn't what you're talking about, but it's possible to have a kind of more complex system. But I don't think it necessarily gets to that idea that there is an element of human being which is alienated by quantification and abstraction and sort of putting it into numbers, if you like, that there's a version of rewilding as a more therapeutic, psychological, spiritual practice, which is very hard to corroborate through the types of scientific experiment that you know that are held up in high regard.
Especially, I really want to say about the connection of the micro and macro that you mentioned, so which turns into holism. So thank you.
Thank you for your question. Thanks. There's another question from the chat in Turkish, so we'll translate it. Hopefully, Zeynep, do you want to do it? I'm a bit distracted today, so if you could, or we could do both. You know.
Okay, let me just read it. It's a long question.
Just before you start, I should say I should probably go in about 5 minutes. Just I have another meeting starting, so maybe we could make this sort of the last question, perhaps.
Yes, probably. I mean, even reading the question will take 5 minutes. So
yes.
Probably.
Well, let's take this question. I have another meeting at 1:45, so that's
okay.
Away, but I'm gonna go make a cup of tea before I start. So.
All right. So. In the question, then I'll summarize. Obviously, I won't be able to translate it one-to-one. So I apologize from all the Turkish speakers and from Fatime. So in the epoch that we're in, where human, okay, Zeynep, help me. Interest is forefront. So there's an anthropocentric approach, and the species, human beings are also. Sömürüyü söyle lütfen Zeynep, hadi.
Exploited.
Exploited. So human beings are also exploited. And people are moving from rural areas to urbanized areas in great densities. So to rewild the cities which are ecologically bankrupt, how do you, what do you think about I mean, it's maybe not a dichotomy between the human and non-human perspectives, but rather a capitalistic and ecological dichotomy. What do you think about this?
Okay.
Thanks for the question, Fatime, and sorry for the translation. Yeah.
I mean, I think if I've got a sense of the question, that there is a tendency to think of cities as ecologically bankrupt, and for good reason. The histories of urbanization has often been premised on the exploitation of resources well beyond the footprint of the city itself. And yet there is a counter argument that suggests that cities can be very efficient ways of organizing non-human life. You have lots of people living in a fairly dense setting. If you can find ways of supplying them with food and energy that don't have this massive consequence on the immediate hinterlands around them. So we might not need to give up on the city as an ecological possibility. We just need to think quite seriously about the footprint of the city as it kind of cascades out into other places, and to think about dramatic inequalities within cities, and to think about how you might improve the ecological habitats of people in cities across a range of scales, whether that's quality of housing, the absence of infectious disease, absence of good food, and all the rest of it. So I think I'd want to sort of push back and defend the city, without necessarily saying everybody should live in the city, but that there is a future of the city rather than a kind of return to or retreat to the countryside.
Great, thanks a lot. And yeah, thanks everybody for joining in. I wish there were more people, but this is also really nice. I think it's an elite, small group, and it was a really great discussion, very inspiring. Thanks so much for, giving us so much of your time and for your beautiful books. So, yep, thanks.
Which I ordered 2 copies for you and me, Elif. I just ordered 2 copies. Thank you.
Thank you very much
Perfect.
for your time and for coming along, and yeah, happy to follow up with questions if people want to send me an email if there's anything that we've missed.
That would be great. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay,
Bye.
cheers then. Okay,
Bye.
bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Tamam. Sağ ol Melis. Görüşürüz. Bay bay. Biz bize kaldık mı? Zeynep uyudu herhalde.
İştedir ya.
Olabilir. Evet. Onu da ben çıkartayım madem. Recording'i kapat.